Nobody saw it coming. The clippers buzzed to life in the cold night air as 6 officers surrounded her, laughing as they shaved her head completely bald. They thought she was just another quiet lieutenant who needed to be taught a lesson about respecting the base hierarchy. She stood there, silent and emotionless, not fighting back, not saying a word. They had no idea who she really was. When the Monday morning assembly was called and a 3-star general walked into that auditorium unannounced, those same officers felt their blood run cold. What happened next would destroy their careers, send them to military prison, become a legendary cautionary tale told across every military base. Because the woman they humiliated as a joke, the one they thought was powerless, was actually a major conducting a covert investigation. And she had documented everything. This is the true story of how one prank turned into 6 arrests, how the officer, nobody expected to fight back, became the one nobody could forget. The military base was located in a remote area, far from the nearest city. It was a training facility where new recruits learned the basics of military life and discipline. The base had been operational for over 30 years, and thousands of soldiers had passed through its gates. On this particular October morning, the air was crisp and cold, and the sun had just begun to rise over the horizon. Casting long shadows across the training grounds, Lieutenant Emma Clark had arrived at the base 3 weeks earlier. She was 28 years old and had been in the military for 7 years. Though no one at this base knew much about her background, she had been assigned to the training facility temporarily, filling in for an instructor who had been injured during a field exercise. Emma kept to herself mostly, arriving early for her duties and leaving promptly when her shift ended. She did not socialize with the other junior officers or participate in the evening gatherings at the base recreation center. The other instructors found her quiet demeanor unusual. Most junior officers were eager to make connections and build relationships that could help their careers. Emma seemed indifferent to such concerns. She performed her duties efficiently, trained the recruits with competence, and then disappeared to her quarters. Some of the staff interpreted her behavior as arrogance. Others thought she was simply shy or awkward. A few suspected she might be dealing with personal problems that made her withdrawn. What no one realized was that Emma was not just another junior officer passing through the training facility. Her assignment to this remote base was not random, and her quiet observation of daily operations was not due to shyness. She had been sent there for specific reasons that had nothing to do with filling in for an injured instructor. But Emma maintained her cover perfectly, never revealing anything about her true purpose or her actual rank within the military. Hierarchy. The base had its usual social dynamics. There were cliques among the officers, rivalries between different units, and an informal hierarchy that sometimes mattered more than official rank. 3 officers in particular had formed a tight group that dominated much of the social atmosphere. Captain Derek Morrison, Captain Lisa Chen, and Lieutenant Marcus Webb had known each other for years, having served together at multiple postings. They were confident, outgoing, and popular among the junior staff. Derek was the unofficial leader of the group. He was 32 years old, tall and athletic, with the kind of natural charisma that drew people to him. He had a quick wit and enjoyed being the center of attention. His military record was solid, though not exceptional. He was competent at his job, but had never demonstrated the kind of outstanding performance that led to rapid advancement. Still, he was well liked by his superiors and had built a network of relationships that served him well. Lisa was equally confident, had a sharp sense of humor that sometimes crossed into mockery. She was skilled at reading social situations and knew exactly how to navigate the informal power structures of military life. She came from a military family and had grown up understanding how the system worked. Her career had progressed steadily, and she expected to continue advancing through a combination of competence and strategic relationship building. Marcus was quieter than the other 2, but still very much part of their group. He was good at his job and loyal to his friends. He tended to go along with whatever Derek and Lisa suggested, rarely questioning their judgment or challenging their decisions. He valued belonging to their circle and did not want to risk losing that status by causing friction. The 3 of them had noticed Emma shortly after she arrived. They found her standoffish behavior irritating. In their view, She was failing to respect the social customs of the base. She did not laugh at Derek's jokes during meals. She did not participate in the informal gatherings where officers bonded. She did not seek their approval or try to ingratiate herself with the established social hierarchy. To them, this was a sign of disrespect that needed to be addressed. At first, they made subtle attempts to put her in her place. Derek would make comments about her silence during group discussions. Lisa would offer fake friendly advice about how to better fit in with the base culture. Marcus would repeat things the other two said, reinforcing their message. Emma ignored all of it. She remained polite but distant, continuing to focus on her work and avoid social entanglements. This response frustrated the trio. They were accustomed to having influence over the social atmosphere of whatever base they were stationed at. Junior officers usually sought their approval, or at least acknowledged their status. Emma's indifference felt like a challenge to their informal authority. Over several weeks, their initial irritation grew into something more pointed. They began discussing among themselves how to teach, or a lesson about respecting the base hierarchy. The idea emerged during a late evening at the recreation center. Derek, Lisa, and Marcus were having drinks and complaining about various frustrations. The conversation turned to Emma and her antisocial behavior. Derek mentioned that someone needed to knock her down a peg, to remind her that she was just another junior officer who should show proper respect to those who had been at the base longer. Lisa agreed enthusiastically, adding that Emma acted like she was better than everyone else. Marcus suggested they could play a prank that would embarrass her in front of the other staff. Something that would force her to show some emotion and break through her cold exterior. Derek's eyes lit up at the suggestion. He began brainstorming ideas, each one more elaborate than the last. Lisa laughed and added her own suggestions. The three of them were enjoying themselves, feeling clever and justified in their planning. In their minds, they were simply engaging in harmless military tradition. Pranks were common, and what they were planning was just a way to bring an arrogant junior officer back to reality. Over the next week, they refined their plan. They recruited a few other junior officers who were willing to help, mostly people who wanted to stay in the good graces of Derek's social circle. The target would be Emma, and the method would be both humiliating and memorable. They would catch her off guard in a situation where she could not easily defend herself or escape. The plan required timing and coordination, but they were confident they could pull it off. Emma remained unaware of the conspiracy forming around her. She continued her daily routine, training recruits, observing base operations, and taking detailed notes in her private quarters each evening. Her mission was progressing as planned. She had identified several issues with base procedures that would need to be addressed. She had also begun to notice certain patterns in how the base was managed, patterns that raised concerns about discipline and professional standards. The base commander, Colonel James Patterson, was a competent officer who ran the facility efficiently. However, he was also somewhat detached from the daily social dynamics among his junior staff. He trusted his captains and lieutenants to maintain appropriate conduct and did not micromanage their interactions. This hands-off approach had allowed certain informal power structures to develop that were not always healthy or professional. Derek's group had flourished in this environment. It's building influence without much oversight. Emma had observed this dynamic carefully. She had seen how Derek, Lisa, and Marcus operated, how they influenced younger officers, and how they sometimes bent rules or cut corners when they thought no one important was watching. She had documented several incidents that suggested a lack of proper discipline and professional standards, but she had not yet acted on this information. Her orders were to complete a full assessment before making any reports or recommendations. The opportunity for the prank came on a Friday evening. Most of the senior staff had left the base for the weekend, heading to the nearby town for some personal time. Only essential personnel and a handful of junior officers remained on duty. Emma was scheduled for a late shift supervising some evening training exercises. After her shift ended, she planned to return to her quarters to review her notes and prepare her weekly report. Derek, Lisa, and Marcus had planned everything carefully. They knew Emma's schedule. They knew which route she would take back to her quarters. They had positioned their helpers at strategic points. When Emma finished her shift and began walking across the base toward the residential area, they set their plan in motion. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and the base was quiet. Most buildings were dark, except for security, lighting that cast pools of illumination along the pathways. Emma walked with her usual purposeful stride, her mind occupied with thoughts about the training session she had just supervised. She noticed nothing unusual until she turned a corner near one of the administrative buildings. Suddenly, she was surrounded by 6 people, all of them junior officers she recognized. Derek stood directly in her path, grinning. Lisa and Marcus flanked him, and 3 other officers blocked any escape routes. Emma stopped walking and assessed the situation calmly. Her expression did not change. She simply looked at Derek and waited for him to explain what was happening. Derek's grin widened. He made a comment about how Emma needed to learn some humility, about how the base had a tradition of welcoming new officers properly, and about how she had been avoiding that welcome for too long. His tone was mocking, but tried to maintain a veneer of joviality, as though this were all in good fun. Emma asked them to step aside and let her pass. Her voice was level and professional. Derek laughed and said that would happen soon enough, but first, they had a little initiation ceremony to perform. He nodded to 2 of the other officers, who moved closer to Emma. One of them was holding something that Emma could not see clearly in the dim light. She tensed slightly, preparing to defend herself if necessary, but still maintaining her calm exterior. Lisa stepped forward and explained that they had decided Emma needed a new hairstyle, something more appropriate for someone who needed to be taken down a notch. She held up electric hair clippers, the kind used for military regulation haircuts. The group thought it would be hilarious to shave Emma's head completely, leaving her embarrassed and humbled. They expected her to protest, to show fear or anger, to finally display some emotion that would satisfy their need to break through her composure. Emma's mind worked quickly. She could fight back. She had the training to defend herself against 6 people if necessary, but that would reveal capabilities that were supposed to remain hidden. It would also escalate the situation in ways that might compromise her mission. She made a split-second decision to allow this to happen, to endure whatever humiliation they had planned, and to deal with the consequences afterward. Sometimes the best response to aggression was to absorb it and strike back later when the timing was more advantageous. She stood still and did not resist as they grabbed her arms. She did not speak or plead or show any reaction at all. This unnerved her attackers slightly. They had expected resistance, or at least visible distress. Emma's complete lack of response made the prank feel less satisfying than they had anticipated. But they had committed to the plan, and a small audience of other junior officers had gathered to watch. Backing down now would make them look weak. The clippers buzzed to life. Emma felt hands holding her head in position. The first pass of the clippers cut through her hair, leaving a bare strip across her scalp. Then another pass, and another. Her hair fell in clumps around her feet. The group laughed and made jokes, trying to maintain the atmosphere of harmless fun despite the increasingly obvious cruelty of what they were doing. Emma remained absolutely still, her face expressionless, her eyes focused on a point in the distance. She gave them nothing, no satisfaction, no reaction. The entire process took less than 5 minutes, but to the observers, it felt longer. The initial laughter from Derek's group had become forced and uncomfortable. Emma's complete lack of response was unsettling. She did not cry, did not beg them to stop, did not show anger or fear. She simply stood there and accepted what was being done to her with a stoicism. That made the perpetrators question whether they had actually achieved anything meaningful. When the clippers finally stopped and Emma's head was completely shaved, Lisa stepped back and examined their work with an expression that was less triumphant than she had expected to feel. Emma looked different certainly, but her bearing had not changed at all. She stood with the same straight posture, the same level gaze, the same calm demeanor that had irritated them in the first place. If anything, without hair to soften her features, her face looked harder and more authoritative. Derek tried to salvage the moment by making another joke about how Emma now looked like a proper soldier. A few people laughed, but the sound was hollow. Marcus and the other participants were already looking uncomfortable, beginning to realize that what had seemed like a funny prank moments ago now felt like something else, something meaner, something that crossed lines they had not fully considered when they planned this. Emma finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the evening air. She thanked them for their attention and said she hoped they had enjoyed themselves. The words were polite, but the tone was not. There was something in her voice that made several of the observers take involuntary steps backward. Then Emma turned and walked away, heading toward her quarters, leaving her hair scattered on the ground behind her. She did not hurry. She did not look back. She simply departed with the same measured pace she always used. As though nothing significant had happened, the group stood in silence after she left. The excitement and energy that had fueled the prank evaporated. Derek tried to keep the mood light, suggesting they head to the recreation center for drinks to celebrate their successful initiation of Lieutenant Clark. But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. Lisa and Marcus exchanged glances that suggested they were both having second thoughts about what they had done. The other participants dispersed quickly. Suddenly eager to be anywhere else, Emma returned to her quarters and locked the door behind her. She went to the bathroom and examined her reflection in the mirror. Her head was completely bare, the scalp pale where her hair had protected it from the sun. She looked different, but not diminished. If anything, she looked more severe, more intimidating. She allowed herself a small smile. The situation was unfortunate, but it was also informative. The incident had revealed exactly the kind of disciplinary problems she had been sent to document. She took photographs of her shaved head from multiple angles using her phone. Then she sat at her desk and wrote a detailed account of what had happened, including names, times, and locations. She described the incident objectively, without emotional language, simply documenting the facts. When she finished, she encrypted the report and sent it through secure channels to her actual commanding officers. Then she went to bed, setting her alarm for the usual early hour. Tomorrow would be interesting. Across the base, Derek's group was having a very different evening. The initial satisfaction they had felt was giving way to creeping anxiety. Lisa was the first to voice what they were all beginning to think. She asked Derek if maybe they had gone too far. Shaving someone's head against their will might be considered assault rather than just a prank. Derek dismissed the concern aggressively, saying that Emma was just another junior officer and that these kinds of initiations happened all the time in military culture. No one would care. But Marcus was not convinced. He pointed out that Emma had not reacted the way they expected. Most people would have been crying or angry or scared. Emma had been none of those things. Her calm acceptance was unnatural, and it made him wonder if they had misjudged the situation. What if Emma was not just some quiet junior officer? What if there was more to her presence at the base than they understood? Derek told Marcus he was overthinking it. They had successfully put an arrogant officer in her place, and that was the end of it. Emma would be too embarrassed to report what happened, and even if she did, it would be her word against 6 others. The base commander was not going to take serious action over a prank. They were safe. Derek spoke with confidence. But even he felt a nagging doubt that he refused to acknowledge the weekend passed quietly. Emma performed her assigned duties without any change in her demeanor. She did not mention the incident to anyone. She did not seem embarrassed by her shaved head or make any attempt to cover it. She simply continued her routine as though nothing had happened. This behavior was noted by several other officers who had heard about the prank. Word had spread quickly through the base grapevine, and people were discussing it in hushed conversations. Some thought Emma's lack of reaction proved she was as cold and arrogant as Derek's group had claimed. Others felt uncomfortable about what had been done, sensing that it crossed a line regardless of how Emma responded. A few people who had been at the base longer remembered other incidents involving Derek, Lisa, and Marcus. Patterns of behavior that suggested this was not the first time they had used their social influence inappropriately, but no one spoke up publicly. In military culture, there was strong pressure not to report fellow officers, not to be seen as a troublemaker who could not handle internal matters. Colonel Patterson was off base for the weekend, visiting his family in a nearby city. He remained unaware of what had transpired Friday evening. His second-in-command, Major Williams, had heard rumors about an incident involving Lieutenant Clark, but had not been given details. Williams made a mental note to investigate on Monday, but did not consider it urgent. Pranks among junior officers were not uncommon, and unless someone filed an official complaint, he was inclined to let them handle their own social dynamics. On Sunday evening, Emma received a secure communication through her encrypted device. Her report had been received and reviewed. Her superiors were not pleased with what had occurred, but acknowledged she had handled the situation appropriately given the need to maintain her cover. They informed her that action would be taken shortly. She was instructed to continue her normal routine until further notice. Emma acknowledged the message and deleted it from her device. Everything was proceeding according to procedures now. Monday morning arrived with typical autumn weather, cold and overcast. The base came to life as personnel returned from the weekend. Morning formations were held, work schedules were posted, and the daily routine began. Emma attended her usual meetings and conducted her training sessions. People stared at her shaved head, but she ignored the attention completely. She had work to do, and personal appearance was irrelevant to mission completion. Derek, Lisa, and Marcus had spent Sunday evening at the recreation center. Drinking more than usual and trying to convince themselves that everything was fine, by Monday morning they had mostly succeeded in pushing their doubts aside. They greeted each other with forced cheerfulness and made jokes about their successful prank. When they saw Emma in the dining facility during breakfast, they exchanged satisfied looks. She looked ridiculous with her shaved head, and they had successfully established that she was not someone who could ignore the social hierarchy. At 10:00 hours, Colonel Patterson returned to his office and began reviewing reports from the weekend. Major Williams briefed him on routine matters, then mentioned hearing something about an incident involving junior officers on Friday evening. Patterson asked for details. Williams admitted he only had second-hand information about a prank involving Lieutenant Clark. Patterson frowned and asked why he had not been informed officially. Williams explained that no formal complaint had been filed, so he had not considered it worth disturbing the colonel's weekend. Patterson's frown deepened. To find out exactly what happened and report back within the hour? Then he returned his attention to other paperwork, making notes about supply requisitions and training schedules. He was interrupted 20 minutes later by his secretary, who informed him that he had visitors. 3 senior officers had arrived at the base unannounced and were requesting an immediate meeting. Patterson was surprised. Unannounced visits from senior command were unusual and typically meant something serious had occurred. He went to the reception area and found himself facing 2 brigadier generals and 1 major general. He recognized Major General Helen Rodriguez immediately. She was a legendary figure in the military, known for her brilliance in strategic planning and her absolute insistence on discipline and proper conduct. She had a reputation for being both fair and merciless when dealing with misconduct. Presence at this remote training base was shocking and ominous. General Rodriguez greeted Patterson professionally but coldly. She informed him that they needed to discuss a serious matter involving one of his junior officers. She did not provide details in the open reception area but requested use of his conference room immediately. Patterson agreed quickly, his mind racing through possibilities of what could have brought such high-ranking officers to his base without warning. He led them to the conference room and offered refreshments, which were declined. The atmosphere was formal and tense. Once the door was closed, General Rodriguez got directly to the point. She asked Patterson what he knew about an incident involving Lieutenant Emma Clark on Friday evening. Patterson admitted he had just learned that some kind of prank had occurred, but did not have details yet. Rodriguez's expression hardened. She informed him that 6 of his officers had physically assaulted Lieutenant Clark, restraining her and forcibly shaving her head. Patterson's face went pale. That was not a prank. That was assault and battery. Conduct unbecoming of officers and a serious violation of military law, Rodriguez continued. She explained that Patterson needed to understand exactly who Lieutenant Clark was and why her presence at his base was not what it appeared to be. McClark was not simply a junior officer filling in temporarily. Was actually Major Emma Clark, and she was on special assignment conducting a comprehensive review of the base's operations, discipline, and command structure. She'd been placed at the base undercover to assess how it functioned without the artificial performance that occurred during official inspections. Patterson felt his stomach drop. A field-grade officer had been assaulted by his junior staff, and he had been completely unaware of her true identity or mission. This was catastrophic. Rodriguez explained that Major Clark had been handpicked for this assignment due to her extensive experience in military intelligence and her ability to blend into various environments without drawing attention. Her mission was to identify systemic issues that might not be visible during standard oversight. The assault on Friday evening was not just a crime against an individual officer. It was an assault on a superior officer conducting an official investigation, and it revealed exactly the kind of discipline problems Major Clark had been sent to document. Rodriguez made it clear that she held Patterson partially responsible for creating an environment where such behavior was possible. His hands-off management style had allowed informal power structures to develop without proper oversight. Patterson tried to defend himself, explaining that he had trusted his officers to maintain professional conduct. Rodriguez cut him off. Trust was not a substitute for leadership and oversight. The fact that 6 officers felt comfortable assaulting another officer on his base indicated fundamental failures in command, climate, and discipline. Patterson would face consequences for those failures, but first, they needed to address the immediate perpetrators. Rodriguez ordered Patterson to assemble all personnel in the main auditorium within 30 minutes. Every person stationed at the base was to attend, no exceptions. She did not explain why, and Patterson knew better than to ask. He immediately sent out the emergency assembly order through the base communication system. The order was unusual enough that it generated instant speculation and concern among the personnel. Derek, Lisa, and Marcus received the assembly notification while working in different parts of the base. All 3 felt a surge of anxiety. Emergency assemblies were rare and typically meant something serious had occurred. They wondered if this had anything to do with their prank on Friday, but Derek insisted that was impossible. They had not filed any official reports. Emma had not complained. There was no way anyone important knew what had happened. He convinced the others they were worrying about nothing. By 10:45, the base personnel had assembled in the auditorium. Over 300 people filled the seats, talking quietly and speculating about what was happening. The junior officers who had participated in Friday's incident sat together trying to look casual, despite growing nervousness. Emma sat alone in a middle row, her shaved head drawing occasional glances, but her expression revealing nothing. She knew what was coming and was prepared for it. At exactly 1100 hours, the auditorium doors opened. General Rodriguez entered, followed by the 2 brigadier generals and Colonel Patterson. The room fell instantly silent. Everyone stood at attention. The presence of a major general at a training base was unprecedented, and the formal atmosphere made it clear this was not a routine visit. Rodriguez walked to the podium at the front of the auditorium, her bearing radiating authority and controlled anger. She ordered everyone to be seated. The sound of hundreds of people sitting simultaneously echoed through the space. Then Rodriguez began to speak, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the auditorium. She stated that she was there too. Address a serious failure of discipline and leadership that had occurred on this base. She explained that sometimes the military conducted covert assessments of facilities to ensure proper standards were being maintained when authorities were not obviously watching. Derek felt his blood run cold. Lisa's hands began to tremble. Marcus stared straight ahead, his face draining of color. Around them, other personnel shifted uncomfortably, wondering where this was going. Rodriguez continued, explaining that this base had been selected for such an assessment, and a highly qualified officer had been placed here undercover to observe and document operations. That officer was Major Emma Clark, currently sitting in this auditorium. After having been physically assaulted by 6 junior officers 3 days earlier, the auditorium erupted in shocked murmurs. Heads turned throughout the room as people tried to process what they had just heard. Lieutenant Clark, the quiet junior officer who kept to herself, was actually a major conducting an undercover investigation. And someone had assaulted her. The implications were staggering. General Rodriguez allowed the reaction to continue for exactly 10 seconds before she demanded silence. The room instantly quieted. Rodriguez explained that Major Clark had been documenting various aspects of base operations for 3 weeks. Her mission was to assess training quality, supply management, and most importantly, the command, climate, and discipline standards. What she had documented was deeply concerning. There were numerous instances of officers abusing their informal authority, cutting corners on proper procedures, and creating an environment where junior personnel felt pressured to conform to social hierarchies that had nothing to do with official rank or duty. But the assault on Friday evening had elevated this from a concerning command climate to a criminal matter. 6 officers had physically restrained a superior officer and forcibly shaved her head. They had committed assault and battery. They had violated Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They had conducted themselves in a manner unbecoming of officers. They had done all of this while Major Clark was conducting an official investigation, which added additional layers of misconduct to their actions. Rodriguez's voice grew harder. She stated that this kind of behavior was absolutely intolerable and would be punished to the fullest extent of military law. She then called out 6 names: Captain Derek Morrison, Captain Lisa Chen, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, and 3 other junior officers. She ordered them to stand and move to the front of the auditorium immediately. The 6 individuals stood on shaking legs. Derek's confident demeanor had completely evaporated. Lisa looked like she might be sick. Marcus seemed to be in shock. They walked to the front of the auditorium under the eyes of their entire base. Every step felt impossibly long. They could feel the stares, the judgment, the sudden isolation. People they had worked with for months or years were looking at them with expressions of shock and disgust. When they reached the front, they stood in a line facing the assembled personnel, utterly exposed and humiliated. General Rodriguez looked at them with cold contempt. She addressed each by name and rank, then informed them they were being placed under immediate arrest pending courts-martial for assault and battery, conduct unbecoming of officers, and violation of lawful orders. Military police officers who had been standing at the back of the auditorium moved forward, escorted each of the 6 out of the building in handcuffs. The sound of their footsteps and the clicking of handcuffs echoed in the absolute silence of the auditorium. After they were removed, Rodriguez turned her attention to the remaining personnel. She explained that what they had witnessed was the consequence of failing to maintain proper discipline and professional standards. The 6 officers who had been arrested had convinced themselves that their actions were acceptable because no one in authority seemed to care about the small violations and unprofessional behaviors they engaged in regularly. They had built an informal power structure based on social manipulation rather than legitimate authority, and Colonel Patterson had failed to recognize and address this pattern. Rodriguez stated that Colonel Patterson would be relieved of command, pending an investigation into his leadership and oversight failures. Major Williams would assume temporary command of the base. There would be a comprehensive review of all base operations, procedures, and personnel. Anyone found to have engaged in similar misconduct or to have witnessed such behavior without reporting it would face appropriate consequences. The culture of this base was going to change immediately and completely. Then Rodriguez asked Major Clark to stand and come to the front of the auditorium. Emma stood and walked forward with the same calm, measured pace she always used. As she moved through the rows, people stared at her with new understanding. The quiet lieutenant, who had seemed standoffish, was actually a field-grade officer who had been observing all of them. Her silence had not been arrogance or social awkwardness. It had been professional detachment while conducting an investigation. Emma reached the front and stood beside General Rodriguez. Rodriguez addressed the assembled personnel again, explaining that Major Clark had served with distinction for 12 years. She had multiple combat deployments, specialized training in military intelligence, and a spotless record. She had volunteered for this difficult assignment knowing it would require her to endure social isolation and potential hostility. The fact that it had resulted in physical assault only proved how necessary these covert assessments were. Rodriguez gestured to Emma's shaved head. She stated that Major Clark had chosen not to defend herself when assaulted, despite having the training and ability to do so, because she recognized that her mission required maintaining cover until the proper moment. She had endured humiliation and violation with remarkable composure in service of identifying serious discipline problems at this facility. Her conduct exemplified the kind of professionalism and dedication expected of military officers. Then Rodriguez did something unexpected. She came to attention and saluted Major Clark. The two brigadier generals did the same. Major Williams, understanding what was required, also saluted. Then, one by one, every person in the auditorium stood and saluted. Over 300 people rendering honors to an officer they had misunderstood, and who some had watched being assaulted without intervening. Emma returned the salute, her face still composed, but her eyes showing a flicker of emotion for the first time. After the salutes were completed, Rodriguez dismissed most of the personnel, but ordered all officers from captain rank and above to remain. She also asked several specific junior officers to stay, including those who had been present during the assault but had not participated. When the auditorium had cleared except for about 40 people, Rodriguez began the next phase of her intervention. She explained that everyone remaining in the room bore some responsibility for what had occurred. The officers who had witnessed the assault without intervening were guilty of dereliction of duty. Those who had heard about the incident over the weekend, without reporting it, had violated their obligation to maintain good order and discipline. Even those who had simply observed the command climate, deteriorating without taking action, shared in the collective failure that had allowed Friday's events to happen. Rodriguez stated that each of them would be individually interviewed over the coming days. Their responses would determine what consequences they faced. Some would receive formal reprimands. Others might face administrative action or additional training requirements. The message was clear. Passive complicity was not acceptable. Officers had a duty to maintain standards even when it was uncomfortable or socially risky to do so. Major Clark was then given the floor to present her preliminary findings. Emma spoke for 20 minutes, detailing the various issues she had documented during her 3 weeks at the base. She described instances where officers had taken shortcuts that compromised training quality. She outlined how informal social hierarchies had influenced duty assignments and evaluation reports. She presented evidence of supply irregularities and maintenance standards that did not meet regulations. Her presentation was professional and thorough, delivered without emotion or personal animosity. She did not dwell on her own assault beyond noting it as evidence of the broader discipline problems. Her focus was on systemic issues that needed to be addressed to bring the base up to proper standards. The officers listening realized they were hearing from someone who was not only their superior in rank but also their superior in competence and professionalism. Many felt ashamed of how they had conducted themselves. When Emma finished her presentation, Rodriguez asked if anyone had questions. Several hands went up. One captain asked how long the investigation had been planned. Rodriguez explained that the base had been flagged for review based on statistical anomalies in training outcomes and unusually high turnover among junior officers. Major Clark's deployment had been authorized 4 months earlier, and she had spent that time preparing for the assignment, while other assessments were conducted through conventional means. Another officer asked what would happen to those who were arrested. Rodriguez stated they would face courts-martial in accordance with military law. If convicted, they would likely receive dishonorable discharges, potential prison time, and the permanent destruction of their careers and reputations. The severity of the charges meant there was little chance of lenient outcomes. They had assaulted a superior officer during an official investigation. No military court would view that with anything less than the utmost seriousness. A third question came from one of the junior officers who had witnessed the assault. She asked, her voice shaking, what would happen to those who had watched without intervening? Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. She acknowledged that witnessing unexpected violence created difficult situations, especially for junior personnel who might fear retaliation. However, officers still had a duty to report crimes even when doing so was difficult. Each case would be evaluated individually, taking circumstances into account, but there would be consequences proportional to each person's rank, responsibility, and specific actions or inactions. The meeting continued for another hour. Rodriguez outlined the steps that would be taken to reform the base. New leadership would be brought in. Training programs on professional conduct and military law would be mandated. Anonymous reporting mechanisms would be established. Regular climate assessments would be conducted. The base would be monitored closely for the next year to ensure changes were implemented effectively and sustained over time. When the meeting finally concluded, the officers filed out quietly. Many looked shell-shocked. Their understanding of how the base functioned had been completely upended in the course of one morning. People they had respected or feared were now facing criminal charges. The social dynamics they had navigated carefully for months or years were revealed as inappropriate and unprofessional. Everything felt uncertain and uncomfortable. Emma returned to her quarters briefly to collect some materials, then reported to a temporary office that had been set up for her use during the continued investigation. Over the next several days, she would conduct detailed interviews with dozens of personnel, gathering more information and building comprehensive documentation of everything she had observed. The work was demanding but important. Emma returned to her quarters briefly to collect some materials, then reported to a temporary office that had been set up for her use during the continued investigation. Over the next several days, she would conduct detailed interviews with dozens of personnel, gathering more information and building comprehensive documentation of everything she had observed. The work was demanding but important. Real change required thorough understanding of how problems had developed and been sustained. That evening, Emma sat in her new office and reviewed her notes. She thought about the moment when General Rodriguez had revealed her true identity. The shock on people's faces, the sudden realization that they had misjudged her completely, the understanding that their small cruelties and casual unprofessionalism had been observed and documented by someone whose opinion actually mattered. It had been satisfying in its way, though Emma took no personal pleasure in anyone's downfall. She simply wanted military organizations to function properly and professionals to behave according to their obligations. She touched her shaved head, feeling the stubble that had begun to grow. In a few months, her hair would return, but the impact of what had happened would last far longer. 6 officers would carry the consequences of their actions for the rest of their lives. A base commander had lost his position. Hundreds of personnel had learned that appearance and reality did not always match, and that informal power structures could collapse instantly when confronted by legitimate authority. These were valuable lessons, even if they came at significant cost. Across the base, in a holding facility, Derek Morrison sat in a cell and tried to comprehend how his life had fallen apart so completely in a single morning. Hours ago, he had been a confident captain with a promising career. Now he was a prisoner facing court-martial and the likelihood of prison time, all because of what he had thought was a harmless prank. He kept replaying Friday evening in his mind, looking for the moment when he could have made a different choice. The moments were there, clear in retrospect. But in the flow of events, caught up in group dynamics and his own arrogance, he had not seen them. Now it was too late. Some mistakes could not be undone, and he was living with the consequences of his. The weeks following the arrests transformed the base in ways both visible and subtle. The most obvious change was the immediate increase in formality and professionalism. Officers who had previously been casual about regulations now followed them precisely. Social gatherings at the recreation center became rare and subdued. People who had been comfortable with informal arrangements suddenly treated every interaction as though it might be observed and evaluated. The atmosphere was tense and uncomfortable, but it was also more professional than it had been in years. Major Williams, now serving as acting base commander, implemented sweeping changes to daily operations. Morning formations became mandatory for all personnel, not just enlisted ranks. Weekly training on military law and professional conduct was instituted for every officer. A new system for anonymous reporting of misconduct was established, with clear protections for those who came forward with concerns. Williams was determined to prove he could maintain the standards that Colonel Patterson had allowed to deteriorate. Emma continued her investigation, conducting interviews that revealed disturbing patterns extending back several years. She discovered that Derek's group was not the first to abuse informal authority at the base. There had been previous incidents of hazing, discrimination, and unprofessional conduct that had been handled quietly or ignored entirely. Junior officers described feeling pressured to participate in social activities they were uncomfortable with, or facing subtle retaliation if they reported problems. The command climate had been toxic for longer than anyone had realized. One interview particularly troubled Emma. A female lieutenant described being sexually harassed by a senior officer 18 months earlier. She had reported the incident through proper channels. But the investigation had been cursory, and the officer received only a verbal warning. The lieutenant had requested transfer to another base, and her request had been granted quickly, which should have raised red flags about why she wanted to leave. Instead, the problem was simply moved elsewhere, and the harassing officer remained at the base, continuing his pattern of behavior until he eventually transferred to another posting. Emma documented this, similar cases carefully. Her final report would be comprehensive and damning. It would show that the assault on her was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of systemic failures in leadership, oversight, and accountability. The base had been allowed to develop its own dysfunctional culture because senior officers prioritized smooth operations over difficult confrontations about standards and conduct. This was a lesson that extended far beyond one training facility. The courts-martial for the 6 arrested officers began in December, about 6 weeks after the incident. The proceedings were held at a nearby military legal center. They were not public except for authorized personnel and media representatives. Military justice moved more quickly than civilian courts, especially when cases were straightforward. The evidence against Derek, Lisa, Marcus, and the 3 others was overwhelming. There were witnesses, there was physical evidence, and there were the photographs. Emma had taken immediately after the assault. Derek's attorney tried to argue that the incident was a prank that had gotten out of hand, not a malicious assault. The argument failed spectacularly. The prosecution presented evidence of planning, coordination, and deliberate action. They showed that Derek's group had specifically targeted a superior officer because they found her professional behavior threatening to their social status. They demonstrated that the assault had been designed to humiliate and intimidate. The defense's characterization of events as harmless fun was demolished by the simple fact that they had physically restrained. Someone enforcibly altered their appearance. Against their will, Lisa's defense attempted a different approach, arguing that she had been following Derek's lead and had not fully understood what they were doing until it was too late. This argument also failed. Lisa was a captain and a commissioned officer. She was responsible for her own decisions and actions. Following someone else's bad judgment did not absolve her of culpability. The court found that she had been an active and willing participant who bore equal responsibility for the assault. Marcus tried to express remorse and claimed he had been caught up in group dynamics without thinking clearly about consequences. His attorney presented character witnesses who testified about his generally good conduct in other contexts. The prosecution acknowledged his cooperation and relative lack of leadership in the incident, but emphasized that he had still participated fully in a criminal assault on a superior officer. Remorse did not erase the crime or its seriousness. The verdicts came quickly. All 6 defendants were found guilty on all charges. Derek received the harshest sentence: 5 years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, reduction to the lowest enlisted rank, and forfeiture of all pay and benefits. Lisa received 4 years, dishonorable discharge, and similar reductions. Marcus and the 3 others received sentences ranging from 2 to 3 years, all with dishonorable discharges. Their military careers were over. Their civilian futures were severely compromised. Dishonorable discharges carried stigma that would affect employment opportunities, housing applications, and every background check they would face for the rest of their lives. Emma attended the sentencing hearings. She was required to provide a victim impact statement, though she kept it brief and factual. She explained that the assault had not caused her lasting physical harm, but it had demonstrated serious problems with discipline and professional standards that required addressing. She stated that, while she did not take personal satisfaction in seeing fellow officers imprisoned, she believed accountability was essential for maintaining the integrity of military institutions. Justice was not about revenge. It was about maintaining standards that protected everyone in uniform. After the sentencing, reporters attempted to interview Emma. She declined all requests. Her mission had been to assess base operations and document problems, not to become a public figure. General Rodriguez issued a statement praising Major Clark's professionalism and dedication, noting that her willingness to endure difficult circumstances had exposed serious issues that might otherwise have continued unaddressed. The statement emphasized that the military took assault and professional misconduct seriously at all levels, and that rank provided no protection for those who violated their oaths and obligations. The media coverage of the case was extensive but mixed in its focus. Some outlets concentrated on the dramatic reveal of Emma's true identity and the poetic justice of her tormentors being exposed by a general. Others focused on broader issues of military culture, hazing traditions, and the challenges of maintaining discipline in large organizations. A few used the case to discuss gender dynamics in the military and whether Emma had been targeted partly because she was a woman in a male-dominated environment. Emma refused to engage with any of these narratives publicly, maintaining her professional distance. By January, the base had stabilized under its new leadership. A permanent commander was appointed, a colonel with a reputation for strict adherence to regulations and zero tolerance for misconduct. New officers were brought in to fill positions vacated by those who had been relieved or transferred. Training programs were updated to emphasize professional conduct and ethical decision-making. The changes were real and substantial. Though some personnel quietly resented what they saw as an overreaction to a single incident, Emma completed her final report in February, nearly 4 months after beginning her mission. The document was over 200 pages long and included detailed recommendations for improving command climate, oversight procedures, and accountability mechanisms. She submitted it through proper channels and then waited for her next assignment. She had fulfilled her mission successfully, though at personal cost. The assault itself was a minor matter in the grand scheme of her career, but the broader experience of watching an organization's dysfunction expose itself had been both educational and dispiriting. In March, Emma received orders for her next posting. She would be joining a strategic planning unit at the Pentagon, a significant step up that recognized her skills and dedication. Before leaving the training base, she was awarded a commendation medal for her work during the assessment mission. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by General Rodriguez, the new base commander, and Major Williams. Emma accepted the award with her characteristic quiet professionalism, making brief remarks about the importance of maintaining standards and the collective.
Wow.
On her last day at the base, Emma walked across the training grounds one final time. Her hair had grown back to a short military cut, no longer bearing obvious evidence of what had happened. The physical mark of the assault had faded, though the institutional impact would last for years. She thought about the 6 officers now serving prison sentences, their careers and reputations destroyed by decisions made in a few minutes. She thought about Colonel Patterson, who had lost his command and would likely never be promoted again. She thought about the hundreds of other personnel who had learned difficult lessons about professional conduct and personal courage. Emma also thought about the junior officers and enlisted personnel who had suffered quietly under the previous toxic command climate, the ones who had been hazed, harassed, or marginalized without recourse, the ones who had seen misconduct and feared reporting it. Her mission had been about more than catching people who assaulted her. It had been about changing an environment where such behavior was possible in the first place. That was harder work than simply identifying and punishing specific individuals, but it was more important in the long term. She left the base without fanfare, driving away on a cold March morning. Behind her, the facility continued its daily operations under new leadership and reformed procedures. The changes would persist for a while, though Emma knew from experience that organizational culture was difficult to maintain. Without constant vigilance, old patterns could reassert themselves. Future commanders would face their own challenges in maintaining standards and holding people accountable. This was the nature of leadership in large institutions. Several months later, Emma read a news article about a follow-up assessment conducted at the training base. The evaluation had found significant improvements in command climate, professional conduct, and operational standards. Instances of reported misconduct had actually increased, which seemed counterintuitive until one understood that it reflected greater willingness to come forward rather than more actual problems. Personnel satisfaction scores had improved substantially. Training outcomes had become more consistent and aligned with military standards. The reforms implemented after Emma's investigation had taken root and were producing measurable benefits. Derek Morrison served his sentence at a military prison, where he had ample time to reflect on the choices that had destroyed his life. He had entered the military with ambitions of a distinguished career, perhaps rising to senior leadership. Instead, he would leave it as a convicted felon with a dishonorable discharge and limited prospects. He attended mandated therapy sessions where he was forced to confront his attitudes about authority, power, and respect. The process was uncomfortable and often painful, but it gradually helped him understand how badly he had misjudged both the situation and himself. In quiet moments, Derek thought about that Friday evening when everything had gone wrong. He replayed the decision points where he could have chosen differently. He could have not planned the prank at all. He could have stopped when Emma did not react the way he expected. He could have listened when Marcus expressed doubts. He could have recognized that humiliating another person was not actually funny or justified regardless of how he rationalized it. The opportunities to choose better had been there. But he had been blinded by arrogance and social performance for his friends. Now he would spend years paying for those few minutes of cruelty. Lisa Chen faced similar reflections in her own cell at a different facility. She had always prided herself on her intelligence and social awareness, her ability to navigate complex environments and position herself advantageously. But she had completely misread the situation with Emma, making assumptions based on superficial observations and social prejudices. Her intelligence had failed her because she had applied it in service of maintaining social status rather than pursuing actual understanding. This was a hard lesson that would reshape how she approached interactions for whatever remained of her life after prison. Marcus Webb, serving his shorter sentence, struggled with intense guilt. Unlike Derek and Lisa, who had been the primary instigators, Marcus knew he had mainly been following along because he valued belonging to their group more than he valued doing what was right. He had seen the situation was wrong, had felt uncomfortable with what they were planning, but had not spoken up because he feared losing his place in the social hierarchy. His weakness and cowardice had contributed to someone being assaulted and multiple careers being destroyed. He would carry that knowledge forever. The three other participants who had received similar sentences had their own versions of these reflections. Each tried to understand how they had made such catastrophic errors in judgment. The common thread was that they had all prioritized social dynamics over professional standards, personal entertainment over respect for others, and group solidarity over individual conscience. These were common human failings, but in a military context with its codes of conduct and duty, such failings had severe consequences. Years passed. Emma continued her military career, taking on increasingly responsible positions. She never sought publicity or recognition for the incident at the training base, and she discouraged others from treating it as a defining moment. It had been one mission among many in a long career. It's dedicated to improving military organizations and maintaining professional standards. She took satisfaction in the reforms that had resulted from her work. But she understood that such victories were always temporary. Each generation of military professionals had to learn and relearn the importance of discipline, ethics, and accountability. The training base itself became something of a case study in military education programs. The incident and its aftermath were analyzed in professional military education courses as an example of how command climate failures could lead to serious misconduct, and how proper oversight and accountability could affect meaningful change. The names were changed to protect privacy, but the essential facts were preserved as valuable lessons for future officers about leadership, ethics, and the consequences of allowing standards to slip. General Rodriguez retired from active service after a distinguished career, but she often spoke about the training base incident in speeches and articles. She emphasized that organizations did not fail suddenly. They failed gradually through accumulated small compromises, overlooked violations, and the normalization of unprofessional behavior. Leaders had to remain vigilant and willing to address problems, even when doing so was uncomfortable or unpopular. The alternative was allowing toxic cultures to develop until something dramatic forced intervention, usually at great cost to many people. For the wider military community, The incident served as a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. The quiet officer who seemed unremarkable might be conducting an investigation. The social dynamics that seemed normal might be viewed very differently from outside. The informal hierarchies that people navigated daily might not align with actual authority structures. These realizations produced both healthy wariness and productive reflection about how professionals conducted themselves when they thought no one important was watching. The story of Major Emma Clark and the assault that exposed her true rank became one of those military legends that circulated informally, details changing slightly with each retelling, but the core message remaining consistent. It was a cautionary tale about assumptions, professional conduct, and the importance of treating every person with respect, regardless of their apparent rank or status. It reminded people that you never really knew who you were dealing with, and that behaving properly should not depend on whether someone could punish you for failing to do so. Emma herself rarely thought about the incident anymore. It had been one experience in a career full of challenging assignments and difficult situations. She had long since moved past any personal feelings about being assaulted or the satisfaction of seeing her attackers face justice. What remained was a professional understanding that organizations required constant attention to maintain standards, and that individuals in positions of responsibility had to be willing to endure difficulty in service of larger purposes. These were the principles that guided her work, and they mattered far more than any single dramatic incident. The 6 officers who had been convicted eventually completed their sentences and were released to face uncertain civilian futures. Their dishonorable discharges followed them like shadows, affecting job applications, housing opportunities, and social relationships. Some found ways to rebuild their lives through hard work and demonstrated change. Others struggled with bitterness and never fully accepted responsibility for their actions. But all of them carried the permanent knowledge that a few minutes of poor judgment had altered the entire trajectory of their lives. Some lessons could only be learned through suffering the consequences of mistakes. And theirs was a particularly harsh education in respect, professionalism, and the serious responsibilities that came with military rank and authority. If you like this story, please subscribe my channel to appreciate and for our struggle. Thank you.